Welcome back to Lokad. An optimal decision is often viewed as the pinnacle of efficiency, a situation where resources are perfectly allocated, costs are reduced, and profits maximized. Now, this sounds great in a textbook or in a classroom, but often such ideas falter upon contact with the real world. Today's guest, Ian Wright, is going to talk to us about this very quest for optimality. Ian is the founder of Logistics Sciences and has over 40 years of supply chain experience. As always, if you like what you hear, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn. And with that, I give you today's conversation with Ian Wright. All right, great. Well, Ian, thanks very much for joining us. For people who might not be familiar with you, I introduced you earlier, but for anyone who's not familiar with your work, could you give a brief introduction, please?
Well, I think you mentioned I've been around for 40 years. I've actually been around for a lot longer than that, but my career's spanned 40 years. Academically, my background is basically after an interest in economics and geography, I brought that together in studying what was at the time just known as transportation or transport, where I come from. And that it was basically economics, geography, business. And that sparked, through the studies there, it sparked a great interest in problem solving, specifically in what is now called logistics and operations research. So I then went on to do operations research, but still focusing very much on transportation problems, logistics problems, and now what we all know as supply chain. So that was some 40 plus years ago. And then moving on to actually having to earn a living, I entered the oil industry as a management scientist working for Castrol. And I was almost thrown in at the deep end, as it were, because I got straight into some very high-level strategic planning projects. I wrote a number of preventative maintenance systems for the distribution arm of the company, and I got to know planning software from a network standpoint and from a fleet planning standpoint, and then moved on to actually join the company that provided those systems. That company being one guy at the time, so there were two of us, and helped him build that. And then I moved over to the States with a client of the company and got involved in GIS. And use of GIS as the visualization arm of what we were doing on the planning side. So that was an early intro to the what is prevalent today around GIS and visualization back in the early 80s. So from there, I got into third-party logistics, initially through a software development project. But I've been aware of 3PL in the UK throughout my career. But it was actually in the early 90s, it was quite new in the States. And they were only just developing. So they were only just developing the idea of putting solutions together to sell them to customers. Those solutions being, where should we put your warehouse? How should we operate your transportation? And so on. So that was, again, great application of my background, but importantly for me, it was a great learning lesson in terms of it was planning for implementation and execution and not walking away from it, being part of having to operate the solution that you put together, which I think is a good lesson for everybody who's involved in what we do. So eventually I moved out of the actual planning and I put a couple of solutions groups together and ran the solutions groups. Then I moved on and became more and more responsible in the organizations that I worked for. But eventually, sort of having gone through a period of working in consulting, which I didn't enjoy too much, I decided I should form a consulting firm. So logistics sciences, and I think we were going to talk, you want to know what logistics sciences is. It's basically me trying to get back to what I enjoy doing, which is problem solving, particularly focused around supply chain and logistics issues, and using what limited knowledge I have and what limited tools I have to actually help people solve problems in that sphere. So I don't know if that sort of helps you know where I'm coming from. I have no idea where I'm going to, but
Well, thank you, Ian. And actually, Joannes, I'm sure a lot of that resonates with you. I mean, the idea of problem solving and reconsidering the problem of supply chain decision making, that's something that resonates strongly with you, no?
Yes, I mean, you see, in terms of intentions, the intentions laid by Operation Research, after Second World War, I think were very correct in the sense of let's try to have some sort of let's try to engineer those management methods into something that is numerically sound and improvable. That was, I think, one of the intent that was I would say correct and is still very relevant today. The challenge is that it's very interesting. People very frequently talk about the various winters that AI, artificial intelligence, went through. With inflated hopes and then disappointment in the fact that it wasn't working. I believe that Operation Research went through similar phases and certain series of waves of methods that were known at the time just didn't manage to turn into real actionable benefits for companies.
Well, actually, that kind of transitions basically to the topic of the conversation today, which Ian was sort of inspired by seeing your work on LinkedIn. You actually publish a lot of papers. I actually have one of them here in front of me, upon which I have made notes. Hopefully the camera can get that. So I have read it. We've all read it. But that paper was, and I read this, I'm the guy. It was free, thank you. So the paper, in particular, the one that sparked the interest in the conversation, why there is no such thing as an optimal solution in supply chain planning and logistics network optimization. Now it's about 13 pages. For anyone who hasn't read it, an executive level summary, please.
It's basically trying to get across the notion that different people have different ideas about what optimality is. And generally, what I find is that they're opposing ideas, or not opposing so much as they just conflicting ideas, in a sense that the practitioner's idea of optimality is often very much more focused on what he's doing in the tool or with the technique that's being employed, and is quite often, which comes back to something that Joannes was saying there, it's quite often focused on the mathematics. Whereas the person who is the victim or the recipient of the optimization is the business guy. I'm assuming we can focus on business and private sector, although there's obviously a great deal more that we can do around supply chain. But the business guy is not at all concerned, or shouldn't be at all concerned, about the mathematics or the methodology or the tool or the model. And I get focused on, when I work with my own clients and in projects, I get focused on trying to make sure they understand that the tools that we employ, the models that we build, are only a small facet of driving them to a solution that they can use in making a decision and implementing something. So the basic premise of the article was to get across this idea of the model's not the important piece, it's the solution, and there's so many more components, so many more facets to a solution that makes sense for the business.
Just on that, and Joannes, I'll come to you in just a minute, but I like the way you framed that. Again, when you're explaining it to your own clients, you're trying to, and I wrote it down, essentially making sure people understand. And on that point, I think a key word to clear up immediately is when you say optimality. And again, you made the distinction between the practitioner and the mathematician. Often certain language can mean slightly different things depending on where it's being used. Joannes and I recently did a discussion on heuristics, and again, a heuristic in a mathematical sense versus an economic sense, maybe slightly different. So when you talk about pursuing an optimal decision or presenting optimality, what do you mean exactly, please?
So generally, I think of optimality not in the sense of a mathematician.
Okay.
Because to my mind, that's a wonderful notion to focus on if you're living in the world of mathematics. But what we have to live on is what is the best solution in the circumstances that prevail. So
Okay.
what's really going on? What's really going on in the world? We need to find out what's going on. And then we need to present a solution that says the best we can come up with in these circumstances that will alleviate or mitigate most of the issues that we find in the circumstances. That's the solution that we're seeking, that we want to present.
Joannes, yeah, thank you, Ian. So again, the idea being the best available does not mean perfect in absolute terms. Anything you want to add to that, or you agree?
Yes, I mean, to bounce on the characterization of the optimization, I would say the optimization perspective in mathematics being beautiful. I agree. It is something extremely simple. I can summarize it for the audience. It's the idea that you take a function that is going to give you a score, and what you want, and then part of the input of these functions are your variables, what you can decide, what can vary according to your will. So that's going to the input, and then the function gives you the score. And fundamentally, the optimization is seeking this one combination of input, that is the formalization of your decision, that extremize the result. Extremize, like minimize if you're trying to diminish your cost, or maximize if you want to maximize the returns, something like that. And the interesting thing is that these simple problems comes with a nice, clean mathematical characterization. Then you can say all sorts of interesting things about your inputs. You can say all sorts of interesting things about your output, how it behaves, and what classes of algorithm exist to seek a solution, and whether you will be able to, in mathematical terms, say that under those assumptions, whether your method is, the best that it can be or not, etc., etc. So, and by the way, this entire field of research is now pretty much named OR. It used to stand for operational research, but nowadays it's just mathematical optimization. And they are not even concerned anymore about whether they are talking about a business problem or not. Their concern is the development of solvers, which is a class of software that is designed to perform those optimizations in a mathematical sense. Now, that is, I would say, when we think in terms of optimization in the math, I think it is the sort of most, I would say, crystal clear understanding of what optimization is. Doesn't mean that by being, crystal clear, doesn't mean that it's the most relevant. It just means that it's the sort of purest, as in, crystal purity. Doesn't mean that it's the applicable tool for all situations. And when we think in terms of optimization in a business context, what we mean is we want to improve things, but with a quantitative edge. You see, that's the difference, because I can also improve a business by, for example, having a better culture where people are more dedicated, but it's almost impossible to quantify anything about that. So when we say optimization, what we mean is that we mean to improve with quantitative instruments and ideally quantitative results as well. That would be, sort of, and thus when I go back to your, I would say, optimization as you understand it, I would describe it as mostly a process of quantitative improvements. That would be, that is completely, I would say, the business perspective of optimization.
I fully agree with Joannes. It's one of the things that we have to understand is also related to optimal. Is there are dimensions involved in the problems that we're looking at, and quite often those dimensions are ignored or left out. And some of the more basic ones Well, in fact, the perhaps most basic dimension is the dimension of time.
That's what I was writing.
And that has a massive bearing on what you can do with the model or the technique or the technology, and what you have to do in operation in the real world, and what you're able to do in those circumstances. And it changes the nature of what you can consider as optimal.
Well, actually, and again, that's a perfect phrase again, what you're able to do. And that, again, transitions to discussion of what I think is, and I know for Joannes is certainly a key element of any discussions about optimality or basically decision making, is the nature of uncertainty when trying to make those decisions. So in your paper, you talk about uncertainty and the real complexity that exists in supply chain. So could you comment a bit further on the sources of uncertainty that actually influence one's pursuit of optimality in whichever way one wants to optimize?
There are lots of flavors of uncertainty. And even to the extent of there are flavors that you can't taste because you don't even know they exist. So there's what most people focus on as uncertainty, which to my mind is simply a reflection of the dynamic nature of the field of supply chain operations. They're just dynamic. So there is uncertainty related to those dynamics. And that is open to analysis and quantitative analysis and probabilistic analysis, which I know you guys are very much focused on. But then you do move beyond that to certain areas of uncertainty, which move more into the area of risk. So there are small risks and there are extremely large risks, and that's also mirrored by the fact that you go beyond a predictable or a probabilistically predictable context to the point where you're actually talking about which I think I talked about in the paper. You're talking about black swan events. I just lost the whole thing. So sorry. So you might have to edit that, but you move from a scale of the small world model, which is predictable, has elements that you can predict from data that you can acquire quite easily. You move then on to black swan events, which essentially can happen, but the ability to predict them is much more remote. And in fact, eventually certain black swan events, you simply can't predict them. You just know that they can happen. And then I think even more catastrophically, quite often in lots of circumstances, are what I term in the paper, by borrowing a phrase, are the unknown unknowns.
Donald Rumsfelder.
Well, it wasn't actually Donald Rumsfeld. It was a guy before that. He pinched the idea just like I did. But anyway, so and then that leads you on to, well, how far do we really have to go to understand not only the unknown unknowns, which we can't, and we can't allow for that. Even the black swan events, we can't necessarily allow for that in general operational terms and in planning. But the predictable that's based on probability, we can and should allow for. And what I would also say is you can move into a different dimension of operation, where you're actually, and I think I talked about this in the modeling, you don't just look at a solution, you look at a solution that is comprised of many contingent elements that you can switch to or can be switched to and executed as required. But the focus is to stay as close to what you have termed optimal in your preferred solution.
Well, actually, to piggyback on the non-Donald Rumsfeld inspired quote, but other sources of uncertainty that people think are known knowns would be, as you said in the paper, Ian, stable demand and predictable supply chains. So, Joannes, these are known knowns or known unknowns or unknown unknowns?
Yeah, I think this typology is nice, but again, if we go back to the basic instrument that we have to do those quantitative analysis, if I go back again to the sort of things that have been developed as part of operation research, the time dimension was absent. The first reason why it is absent is like super mundane, is because then you increase the dimensionality of your problems, and those methods behave very poorly when you try to deal with more complex methods. They are not very scalable, at least not in the way we refer to I would say, scalable solutions nowadays, especially if you look in the lights of the recent development of what happened, let's say, on the deep learning front line. So first problem is that we had this super basic problem of dealing with scalability, thus no time dimension. And then once we start considering the time dimension, the future is not perfectly known. Thus, we have to deal with variability of some kind, and here that would be just known unknown. You know, it is a very mild case of uncertainty. It is very much expected that lead times will vary. It is very much expected that demand will vary, etc. So those cases are relatively easy, and then we are entering the territory of what is called stochastic optimization, because suddenly your decision might reveal itself as good or bad depending on future circumstances that you do not control. So there are like alternative futures where this decision looks good, but there are certainly possible futures where it will reveal itself as in time as being like a poor decision. So that's, I would say, the sort of very mundane problems that we have. Then before jumping into the unknown unknowns and all those sort of, I would say, wild variety of uncertainties, we have more basic problems still. And that's where I think this idea of extra facets is very interesting. We just do not really know how we should score anything. It's not obvious. There are, when we say we want to optimize profits, there is indefinite number of ways to count profits. Should we include the second order effects, the third order effects? What do I mean second order effect? You give a discount of 10%. Now the customer expects the next time they walk into the store to get a similar discount again. Thus, this is a second order effect. You just gave a discount, but it cost you more.
Because you inspire the expectation.
Yes. So again, that should be scored. And then if you do that, you do a discount, your competitors might aggressively decide to compete even more fiercely on price. Or they might eventually completely give up on competing altogether, leaving you alone. Alone, or at least with fewer competitors. So you see, all of that is very, I would say, those very mundane aspects of what am I quantifying exactly are difficult. And I think that's also another sort of facet that is not really addressed in the classic, I would say, optimization literature, is that they think as if the problems were well understood right from the start.
So on this topic, again, be it known knowns or unknown unknowns, Ian, in your paper, you mention a lot of concrete examples of companies that have succeeded or failed in addressing the kinds of uncertainty that we just talked about, be it lead times, be it demand, erratic demand patterns, whatever. Could you share some more details of these case studies, please?
Yeah, so a lot of the projects that I work on are generally more strategic. Some are tactical. I don't really work any longer in the realm of planning for execution, as it were. So most of the examples that I would think of in this regard relate to companies that fail to plan tactically or strategically by not addressing these issues around predictability or lack of predictability. So just recently, in the last 3 years, there was an event a year before that I think nobody would say that they had predicted. Certainly, I believe no systems for planning in any company had conceived of and incorporated elements of planning that would account for the impact of the pandemic and what happened to stocks and the implications of inventory drawdown, the sudden decrease in demand, and so forth. So many different widely spread implications. And I know that the classic example there is around semiconductors. And in the but my experience was twofold in so many companies coming out of the pandemic in food manufacturing and in not just pharmaceuticals, but in medical appliance, in the health and care logistics sector as a whole, suddenly realized that they had to plan for something they hadn't anticipated, and they were working against their intrinsic their in-house systems that manage the business, that manage their supply chains, because those systems no longer provided them with data that was capable of building the basis of models to understand what they should do next. So I worked on a lot of projects for food manufacturers who were trying to catch up with the immense explosion in demand in places that they didn't have capacity, and they needed to understand very quickly where that capacity should be placed and why it should be placed there. And there were so many fundamental problems with trying to work out how you go about doing that, because it was very similar, it was very akin to saying, how do you build a supply chain for a product that doesn't exist today? How do you plan for that? And then the whole notion of how you then go on to execute is the next stage thing. But sorry, Conor, go.
No, not at all. But simply that's a nice transition then to Joannes. I mean, this is very much your métier, like executing solutions to situations that are rife with uncertainty. So any examples of successes or failures with companies when it comes to the kinds of uncertainty we're discussing?
Yes, I think, if we go back to this year of lockdowns, 2020, 2021, the interesting thing is that Lokad had, I would say, very nice operational successes, but I think precisely because we were doing optimization. So let me describe, what most companies are doing nowadays through essentially their, I would say, an ocean of spreadsheets. They are not optimizing anything, neither in the mathematical sense nor in the way that we just described. What they are essentially doing is largely reproduce what has been done before. So they are pretty much pattern matching their own previous decisions. They are not even really following the demand or anything. They are just largely reproducing what they had done before, which means that the budget is slice and dice pretty much the same way it was done last year, that safety stocks are, again, adjusted minimally compared to what was done last year, etc. So everything is done incrementally versus the status quo. There is no optimization taking place. We are just mirroring the status quo. We're steering it a little bit, but not quantitatively, a little bit in the direction that seems appropriate. It kind of works, but that's the thing, is that there is no optimization process taking place, which means that if you widely change your operating conditions, you don't have any mechanism in place to reflect those new conditions. Because again, let me repeat, all your spreadsheets, all your processes in place are designed to replicate what you've done before. So in contrast, Lokad, we were having optimization system in place. what happens when we had unprecedented situations, what happened was that we pretty much manually injected a massive dose of uncertainty into our models. You see, we didn't know what would happen. We just say, okay, demand is, normally we have what we call the shotgun effect. So you see the demand future that just go like that, possibility. Well, if you have a situation like lockdowns, you just increase the angle of the shotgun so that it's very, it's the future becomes like very fuzzy. Same thing for your delays, same thing for your prices. So you just assume that you suddenly know a lot less about the future. That may strange, but you can do that. And if you assume that you suddenly know a lot less, you can rerun your optimization logic, that's a stochastic optimization, to get decisions that are more prudent with regard to the risk that you have. So you kind of slightly take into account of the worst that can happen in terms of delays, of price, of demand, etc., and you just make your decisions a lot more, I would say, conservative with regard to those risks that have quantitatively exploded. And my takeaway is that it works. It do work very nicely. But you have two caveats, is that the problem is to have more optimization, not less, although it's not the sort of, I would say, operational research, static perspective, nothing is moving sort of optimization. And the second thing, it's an extra facet that is, I think, that was almost like never discussed in the during the age of operation research that was probably 1950, 1980, those 30 years, which was the quality of your instrumentation. How fast can you move from one instance of your modelization to the next instance? And that's a really like a matter of practical operational thing.
I think there were practical issues as well related to that because the technology wasn't sufficient. So there was a lack of data because the technology also related to that wasn't sufficient. But certainly the technology to enable the more rapid execution of planning was just not and I can tell you that from having watched optimization models run for 24 hours. As opposed to today, where when I work with guys, they think, well, it hasn't finished and it's been 5 minutes already. What should I do? So I don't mean to interrupt you, Joannes, but I think a lot of that was because we have much better technology today.
I completely agree, and that's I would say a separate concern, but they are really of practical concerns because if you have an optimization technology, but then rerunning take 24 hours and you will need like 20 iterations to kind of converge to something that is relatively satisfying with regard to the new, I would say, state of your supply chain. It's never going to happen. People just revert to spreadsheets. There is just no time to go through all those hoops. You go back to your spreadsheets that may not deliver you this sort of optimization, but they will give you an answer at least within a reasonable time frame. And I think that was also the sort of things where, again, Lokad did well in this period. We had optimization, but we had optimization tools that were sufficiently agile so that they can be tested repeatedly dozens of times per day until we had something that was actually working. Otherwise, our clients would have just given up on the sort of services that Lokad was offering at the time.
So this is interesting because I've always struggled with what I call the snapshot optimization. So particularly supply chain planning and network models have always been snapshot. Mixed integer programming and solvers are all snapshots. And this whole issue of timing. And I've always struggled with how we could take the benefits of simulation type approaches where we are able to incorporate the dimension of time a little bit better, and how we can somehow meld an approach. So for example, there's a company out of Russia, a simulation company that came up with we now combine optimization. Now, I thought that was great at the time. Unfortunately, I'm not very with their implementation of the optimization side of things because they're a simulation company. But the time issue is one thing. The other issue, I think, in this determination of a solution with probability also involves, and it's a technological issue that we're more able to face today. It involves the amount of data, the scope of the data that you can incorporate in deriving the solution. And a lot of things that are outside the realm of the corporation or the company or the division that you're optimizing for are not accounted for. When you've got a new product or when you're coming into a brand new world out of a pandemic, the only thing you can rely on quite often is data that has got nothing to do with the history of your prior operations. You have to look to a much broader scope of data so that when you're coming up with probabilities, for example, you need to incorporate exogenous variables in addition to all the traditional variables that you think of related to the activity that you're trying to continue.
I mean, conceptually, yes, although I slightly disagree on this one. The thing is that data beyond, I would say, transactional data is very, very costly. It's for companies, acquiring data on, let's say, competitive intelligence is kind of okay. That's not too costly. But if you go beyond that, so just scrapping the prices of your competitors. But if you go beyond that, it becomes very quickly very complicated, And our approach is that usually it is just, first you need to have models where you look at your data in a way that is more informative. An example of that would be you launch a new product. You don't have any sales history. So the traditional time series perspective says you have nothing. But if you give up on the time series perspective and you embrace alternative vision of your data, you might see that your product launches have, let's say, a hit or miss sort of pattern. And that the sort of successes that you can expect behave according to some distribution and the say failure as well. So yes, you can in fact use your historical data to say things about the product. Again, because your launches, if a no-name studio launch a movie, the odds that this no-name studio will have will produce a movie that will do $1 billion of, in movie theaters is super, super low. But if it's Disney,
Warner Brothers or something, yes, it would be
then
big,
the odds are maybe at something like 5%. And if it's et cetera, et cetera. So first, I would say my point was using the transactional data that companies have, usually you can tell a lot more than what people usually think it can because they are entrenched into the time series perspective. So there are other ways. And the second thing is that if you admit that you just don't know, and let's realize that people who are going to take those decisions as humans, they don't have secret source of information as well. There is no crystal ball, inside of the human brain that lets you peek into the future or anything. Especially when we are talking about supply chains where we have, let's say, tens of thousands of products that you only know by the fact that they exist. You don't. Many people who would be like a supply and demand planner would not even know exactly what their company is selling or producing. So back to that, I would say, okay, we have our transactional data that can be exploited in more ways than meet the eyes as soon as you give up on this time series perspective. But then you also have the fact that you can acknowledge that, well, this extra information is very difficult to get. So maybe what we should just instead accept is to have a lot of uncertainty. And what I say is that the traditional tools do not even accept dealing with uncertainty at all. When I say traditional tools, I mean I would say all these solvers, so the tools that deliver mathematical optimization of the market, all the solvers that I know that are established do not are just deterministic solvers, as they cannot deal with uncertainty as well. We just received on this channel a pioneer who is trying to establish their prototype stochastic optimizer inside opt.
Oh, Maynard Salman.
Yes, Maynard Salman, who had his seeker instrument. But that's really one of a kind, and that's pretty much the only one that I know that is trying to pursue this, I would say, from a commercial perspective. So back to the case at hand, my take is that if you do not have any instrument to deal with uncertainty under any shape or form, the idea that you will just deal with this situation by just inflating uncertainty and letting it be it's not even thinkable. But I say if you do have those instruments, then it becomes like the very natural thing. You try something unprecedented, uncertainty is through the roof, and your optimizer just let you act accordingly. And that's it.
Yeah, I think where we're sort of getting out of alignment here is because there's a difference in focus between us when you're planning strategically and when you're planning, particularly the closer you get to execution, where actually options diminish dramatically. And I'm coming from a predominantly strategic planning sphere. And when you say, for example, a lot of this additional, for a new product, for example, a lot of this additional scope data is expensive. That may be, but there are lots and lots of different kinds of data that you can deploy in modeling before you get to optimization. You can model the correlation between lots of different exogenous aspects of economic data and demographic data related to the kind of product, the kind of market that you want to serve that product to, and that's where I'm coming from, Joannes, when I talk about adding more data elements. I'm talking about looking at correlation with what is reasonably accessible data generally related to demographics and market penetration and so on. And then another aspect of this, which I think is ultimately what we've always got to think about as technology providers and practitioners in this field, is businesses ultimately are just about finance. So a major element of what we have to do in planning is to boil it down to cost and minimization of cost depending upon the circumstances, right? So cost data, to my mind, has been inadequately employed in, for example, network models for supply chain optimization. And people have been happy to accept assumptions around cost as they put costs into models, as opposed to going out and actually finding, which is very doable, much more concrete expectations around cost. And I think that's just something it's this whole idea of data, because of the technology we now have, it's just so much more rife for focus and more understanding of what we can do around bringing in data to understand more of the scope of the context that we're working in.
But Ian, again, it's a perfect point to push forward a little bit, because, again, once you have all the data, you then have to arrive at a decision eventually. And something that you talk about in the paper as well is the role of trade-offs in making those decisions. So once you have your model, you have all the data, you are still presented with a number of decisions, often just decision optionality. And for you, how do trade-offs fit into the pursuit of the optimal decision?
Yeah, so I'll make one point quickly. You never have all the data. You have the data that you've got, obviously, but it's always flawed. So you have to work with what you've got. Okay, so just take it from there. You never have all the data. I'm a cynic at heart, you can tell, right? But as far as trade-off, there are the obvious trade-offs. In supply chain, your trade-off is basically, they all boil down to, again, financials. Do I want to spend the money to provide the service and the product that my customer wants? Do I want to provide the product in the way that the customer wants me to provide it? And that means I have to spend money to do it. And how far down that path am I willing to go? So the trade-off is inventory versus transportation cost, for example, as a basic. But there are trade-offs related to how many contingencies do I put in place to mitigate risk? How many potential operational paths do I create for my business so that I can execute a probabilistic plan which comes up with something that isn't my normal path of execution? A trade-off is, do I look at short-term implications around the models that I pursue and the plans that I put in place, or do I really involve the long-term, which can quite often mean, again, a financial trade-off, because I'm investing now for something that's not going to happen until a later period. So trade-offs is to me, is kind of euphemism for I've got to get the money right. And how do I balance all those things? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Conor, but it boils down to what am I willing to balance in my model, given that I know I'm limited in the way I can scope my model. What am I willing to balance to get that dollar sign or that euro sign at the right place?
Thank you. And Ian, thank you. And Joannes, I'll come to you now because, again, I'm basically teeing you up for something I know you like to talk about, but Ian there made the point that, at base what people are trying to optimize for explicitly, correct me if I'm wrong, is in fact cost or finances. But the thing is, a lot of the time when we talk about decision making in supply chain, people or companies are trying to optimize things like service levels. And I think you've made the point before that what people think they're optimizing is cost, but really that's, you've used the term, just a numerical artifact. So the question, if you could comment on, is when people focus on those sort of traditional goals, certainly in supply chain, are they in fact optimizing for cost, or are they looking in the wrong direction?
So if we look at the dominant practices of supply chain nowadays, on PowerPoints, they would say that they focus on, I would say, the economic variables. In practice, they do not. It's like percentages all the way in terms of service levels, inventory turns, and whatnot. Those things are loosely correlated to, your bottom line, but only loosely, and
not explicitly.
To assume, or implicitly, it's just that to assume that your profitability is correlated in any shape or form to your service levels is just insane. It do not work. It's not. It is. It's. I would say a very, very simplistic take. So the first thing would be, let's say, is that the dominant practices are, in fact, people know intuitively that they cannot convince anybody if they say that they want to optimize percentages. So in the slides, they will say, we optimize those dollars. But in practice, in their software system, they have rules that are absolutely not aligned in any shape or form with those dollars. Modelization are, I would say, all the ones that I've seen in the wild, putting Lokad aside, were strictly non-financial, non-economic perspectives. Now, if we get to, I would say, an economic perspective, where we start to have those dollars, that I completely agree on the front that it is very difficult to get it right. It is difficult. And in fact, you have plenty of horror stories very frequently told, I would say, in Hollywood movies, where you have the finance guy, the bad guy, who is doing like incredibly stupid, short-termish sort of line of thinking at the expense of something that would be a little bit further away into the future, or this sort of thing. So the financial perspective has a bad rap. And indeed, I think the sort of perspective that operation research emphasized, again, 40 years ago, was a very simplistic take. So they were really going for, I would say, a very short number of variables, cost of stock, cost of this, cost of that, and bam, you're done, job's done. Let's now the magic operate with the optimal solution that will pop out of the model. At Lokad, we noticed that, and indeed, we realized that we had actually a real problem, which is how do we get to the knowledge of whether our scoring function, our economic scoring function, the one that is counting the dollars, is telling I would say an approximate version of the truth that is good enough. You know, it is a very difficult question. And what we discovered was a methodology, it's documented in my series of supply chain lectures, called experimental optimization. The way you know that your economic model is correct is when it generates sane decisions. It's very strange. So in the end, people were thinking you need to have the correct scoring metric so that will give you the optimal decisions. And what we do is pretty much the opposite. We generate the decisions, and then out of those generated decisions that are supposed to be, that have been extremized according to this metric, then we look whether they are sane or not. And when we see obviously dysfunctional decisions that are, blatantly insane, then very frequently we come back to a problem, and the problem is very frequently the economic modelization is wrong and there is something that we missed. And so we have this very, I would say, iterative process where we pick our dollars, we optimize, we get decisions, some of them are insane, we revise the way we count the dollars, and rinse and repeat. And with many iterations, we finally converge on something where nobody anymore has any, that's what we called the zero insanity principle. We want to converge to a setup where the system do not generate any lines that are obviously patently insane right out of the box. And that's actually the point where we at Lokad, that is the point that is necessary before to get to production, actually. But you see, the point is that we completely reverse the sort of perspective that operation research had. Instead of saying that the scoring function is a given, it is something that we are going to discover through an incremental process. And it's very strange because that goes very much, at least for French people, against this Cartesian perspective of bottom-up thinking and applying principles and just unrolling and that's it. It is a much more, I would say, empirical sort of process.
Yeah, so I have to confess, and I apologize for this, but I have to confess my relative ignorance of Lokad. But I'm very intrigued by your definition of sanity in the context that you're talking. What constitutes a sane decision?
You've been reading my notes, Ian.
Yeah. So to give the example of that I gave in my series of lectures is I'm going to start with an analogy and then we'll go back to supply chain. There are classes of problems where if you want to solve the general problem, it is impossibly hard, but particular instances are very easy. An example of that would be, let's say I give you a movie to watch, and I'll tell you this is, let's say, about a Roman gladiator or whatever, and I tell you, please spot if there are things that are completely out of context with regard to the historical time period.
Like a plane in the background.
Like the plane in Gladiator, there is a famous movie shot where, in fact, they are fighting in the arena and there is a plane in the sky in the background. So the thing is, if I ask you to find like a general algorithm to tell me all the things that can go wrong in a movie that do not reflect, the age, the time period, it is like a completely daunting task. You would need an entire encyclopedia of all the stuff that was not invented, even the terms, even the mood, the attitude, the sort of thinking, whatever. It is just an impossibly complicated problem. But in practice, if you put an intern watching the tape, he will tell you, oh, there is a plane here, it's bad. Yeah, I can't give you the list of all the things that are bad, but I can spot this piece of insanity. And the thing is, so that's the analogy that I will use. Supply chain systems are very much like that. It is very difficult to say that it's completely, that you have to give you a general rules to establish exactly what counts as insane or not. So that's a problem of general intelligence. That's not something that you can just, bam, condense into a simple algorithm. But it turned out that people are actually pretty good at spotting those problems. An example would be, you have, let's say, a series of stockouts in your historical data. They are not properly factored in, and suddenly your estimation of the future demand dropped to zero because you had stockouts, so you didn't sell, and your model stupidly forecast zero. And then you end up with suggesting zero replenishment as a good, as a good policy. So it's what is your target stock level? Zero, because we observe very little demand, so let's keep it at zero. If you start thinking about that, yes, my forecast is going to be like 100% accurate because I'm forecasting zero, I'm replenishing zero, and all is well, but no, all is not well. Here I have this problem is called an inventory freeze. But this is a piece of insanity. And you have plenty of situations like that where when you look at decisions, you can identify things that are dysfunctional, where it is just numbers are, implausibly high, implausibly low. There are stuff that just don't make sense. An example that we had, for example, historically at Lokad, for one of our first aviation clients, we started to look at inventory replenishment, and we suggested to buy some of those parts, and then the clients came back to us, say, oh no, we are not going to buy those parts. Those parts will go on a Boeing 747. And 10 years from now, there won't be any Boeing 747 flying above Europe. And those parts have a life expectancy of 4 decades. So if we buy them now, we are only going to use them for 10 years, and then those aircraft will be gone. So that was something obvious where, oh, we forgot to take into account the fact that a part, the usefulness of a part cannot exceed the lifetime of the aircraft it serves. So you see, this is the sort of things where I would say, depending on the verticals, reality will give you an endless stream of stuff that just thrown at your face, that manifestation of those insanity. And although I cannot give you a general rule, I cannot give you an algorithm to tell you how I can detect that. In practice, it just works very nicely because people can spot those things.
So we are now violently on the same page, strangely enough, because I know we want to discuss something that's coming up, but
go ahead.
My major premise in my career is in terms of having worked with all this technology and thrusting technology into the victim's company, has always been you cannot exclude the human. You have to account for, and you have to utilize the human in the process of deploying and using the technology, because right now, and for my foreseeable future, we don't have technology that can replace many of the aspects of the human that you're talking about in terms of recognition of the absurd, for example, or recognition of the insane. It just doesn't exist yet, and the only way it will come to exist is by somehow trying to incorporate aspects of the human in the process that today is just not feasible.
I would agree with you, and there are, I would say, 2 angles that I would like to respond on your comment. First is that sometimes insane decisions, you can only know they are insane after the fact. So you have to do the mistake to realize that something unexpected happened and it was bad. Yes, but I mean, it's just, I would say more than human, it is just that information has to come back from the world. You know, you need feedback, real world feedback to get this information. So I would say, yes, it's a matter of I would say, high level intelligence, but I would say even if we had an artificial intelligence just as intelligent as a human, there are limits because, again, to some extent, the only way you know the world is that you give yourself some leeway to experiment. So that would be the first angle. The second one is on the role of people, is that, you see, the way, and I think that was something that derived from this idea of operation research, is that the way my peers have engineered their systems is that they use humans as co-processors. Human coprocessors. So your system generates decisions, numbers, you know, allocations of resources and whatnot. And then you have all those lines that are insane, and you expect to have an army of clerks to manually step in and fix all of that. And that's, by the way, for the audience, all the systems that have alerts and exceptions are doing just exactly that. So alerts and exceptions is just another way to say we have human co-processors who are going to process the stuff that my system do not process. My problem with that is that, unfortunately, people are quite expensive. You know, this is the cost. And so the way I see that, it's that it's not a very good use of their time, because you are going to have those human coprocessors who are going to endlessly cycle through the same nonsense of the same alerts, the same exceptions. So that's why Lokad, we look at it a completely different way. We say, whenever a piece of nonsense is detected, and that would be something like an alert, an exception, or whatever, then someone, and that would be at Lokad, the supply chain scientist, needs to step in and adjust the implementation of whatever is doing the predictive optimization to fix it so that this problem do not happen again. And no exception. So it's every single piece of nonsense that is addressed is assessed. Is it an actual piece of nonsense, or is it like a very, very clever optimization? But if it is not a clever optimization and it is indeed nonsense, then the optimization logic itself must be fixed. And that's that, because you do not want to the next day have the same employee reporting the same problem again.
So I think we're still on the same page. Certainly, we're on the same chapter. In that, again, I'm coming more from a strategic and tactical scope notion, where I'm not worried about going out and looking at a room full of Big Brother people on computer screens correcting things. I'm talking about what's necessary in the deployment of OR in a strategic or tactical sense. It means really what you've got to do is involve the experienced stakeholder to maintain the sanity in the direction that you're taking and the solutions that you're driving. When it comes to the whole idea of where I think you are framing your argument, Joannes, it is, I think, as we move forward with the kind of technology that you're developing and have developed, and with the general move towards more capability in AI terms, the ability for a system to self-correct in an event management context is going to become more feasible, so that we will move away from the expensive room of human computer operators. But it isn't today. So you have to work within the constraints of the capabilities you have at the time, right? But when I don't disagree with you at all in your argument there.
If I may, just because it sounds as if, Ian, you were coming more from you were commenting more on the role of the human in the strategic And Joannes, you seem to be commenting more about the decision making in the mundane day-to-day sense, or so are these non-overlapping magisteria? Or?
That's because you see, that's where again my perspective, and that's maybe a little bit a strange one, is that if we are going into the realm of strategic consideration, then your focus operating a supply chain should be very much how do I engineer the machinery that generate the proper decisions. You see, people think that, oh, there is like strategic decisions and tactical decisions and whatever. My take is that, no, you have decisions that are repeatable. Some of them are repeated every second, some are repeated every hour, some are repeated every month, some happen once a year. And thus, when it comes to mechanization, you want to mechanize everything that is reasonably repeated frequently enough, and you let yourself the possibility to just deal with the other one in a completely ad hoc fashion. But nevertheless, the strategy, if you start thinking of this approach, is not so much I am going to decide something at a certain level and then let other layers of my organization do their thing at other, I would say, considering different time frame or different scopes. It is more like the strategic vision is that what do I do so that the engineering culture of my company, I would say from this engineering culture emerge the mechanized decision-making processes that really improve my bottom line. You see, that's a completely sort of different way to think about strategy.
Completely in agreement with you. So the way I've often viewed it is the role of it's taking the process of the person who wants a building or any kind of building, and the first involvement is the architect to design the concept of the building and generally the form and function of the building. But then that's handed over to the engineer, the civil engineer, who has to actually say, well, this is actually how it will be put together. And then it's handed over to construction, who actually have to put it together. And then it's handed over to people who have to both work in the building and maintain the building, and they're operating the building. And at all those levels, the architect shouldn't be putting something together that can't be engineered, that can't be built, and that people don't want to use or live in, and are unable to maintain it. Right. So that's my very high level analogy of the process we're involved in. It's a little what we're involved in supply chain, though, is a little different from that architecture, engineer, and so on process, because we're involved in something where you might create a strategy today or your architect's drawing, but you've got to do the same again next year, because the issue with supply chain is it's dynamic, it's adaptive. We have to respond to the changing world and the needs of the world. So again, yeah, you repeat your strategy process, but you have to do it in a feasible manner that's pragmatic and will allow you to implement an operable solution. That's just where I'm.
Yeah, but just to give you some perspective, during the lockdowns year, again, 2020, 2021, the interesting thing is that we had quite a series of clients, more than a dozen, where their white collars went away for 14 months. So Lokad was left alone, taking all the supply chain decisions for companies where all the blue-collar workforce was still operating. The white-collar workforce was on government holidays.
Subsidiary.
Yes, so they were paid, but they were the governments, European governments, were also imposing that people do not work from home, otherwise they would not be paid by the government subsidies. So they were effectively on leave. And Lokad, we managed for a dozen clients to have over €1 billion worth of inventory to be operated entirely for 14 months. And that represented, we are talking of over 1,000 employees, in aggregates. And that's really asks the questions of what is it that those supposedly strategic supply chain processes are delivering? And you see, when I get to that, he said, when I look at most, let's say, s&op meeting, you will have a lengthy discussion to decide how much budget we allocate for purchasing for the various departments. All of that can be replaced by a formula. If we disagree with the formula because it gives insane results, then we fix the formula. But we don't necessarily need to meet 12 directors and all the expenses to get to this budget calculation. It can be automated. And you see, and if you have, in terms of strategy, to think would be, okay, how do I make sure that the engineering that goes into this formula that allocates my top-level resources is I would say, is done in a way that is aligned with the interest of my company. That's a very interesting problem. And yes, this should capture the interests of the management who want to think strategically. The idea of cherry picking a few decisions and saying, I am going to be involved in that, it's not really adding much value. And in a lot of companies, I see that what is happening in those supposedly strategic meetings is a lot of time being wasted. And yes, they do generate decisions, but with a productivity that is absolutely abysmal. I think we had a previous guest that was discussing s&op. And yes, and he was telling me, they were usually ending up with like 4 decisions per hour.
Yeah, that was Eric Wilson.
Yes, in an s&op process. And I was thinking, okay, we just have like hundreds of thousands of decisions to come up with, and now we have a pace of 4 decisions an hour. It is obvious that when you have this sort of situation that the operations are always going to be well ahead of your plans. Your plans are going to be, by the time you come up with your decisions, they are completely obsolete, and people have done something else because they could not wait for so long for those decisions. You see, we end up in this sort of situation where it's more like a masquerade. People take strategic decisions for stuff that already happened like 2 years before.
Yeah. Well, Ian, just to tee you up with a follow-up, because I know in the paper you talked about decentralized, like more decentralized supply chain decision making, and you gave the example of Walmart. And again, it's not well, you can describe it better, I'm sure, actually, than I can.
Doing that properly in an effective way means, you decentralize the decision, but that decentralization and the decision making is still taking place in a context that has been designed effectively and properly, so that you're not moving far away from the corporate central strategy of, right? So there's almost like an escalator of strategy down to operations, and in that case we're talking about decentralization of what I would term more tactical decisions. But the whole comes back to Joannes. I don't disagree with you at all. What we're talking about is people not only work in silos within organizations, but they also plan and function in silos. So we talk about the supply chain guys go off and do their strategic supply chain plan. And then they think about the transportation plan, and they think about the warehouse plan. All these plans are interdependent and unfortunately quite often executed independently, but we can't basically come up. We're always sub-optimizing, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. And even with a, in quotes, optimal strategic solution, supply chain solution, we will be sub-optimizing unless we actually incorporate a network plan and a transportation plan and an inventory plan in an operating model, for want of a better term, so that the whole situation with Lokad operating without the white collar folks in the building is a great example to me of having an operating model, which means you can sustain operations and not move too far away from, keep using the word optimal, which isn't the right word. We have to invent a word. You can operate to the plan that you thought you needed to operate to 6 months ago, despite this disruption, because you have built together the right people the right processes, and you've got the technology, the programs in place to help that execution. So this comes to something that I really maintain much more so than this whole idea of getting the optimality right. And that is, you can have an optimal plan, but you need to be able to execute it and maintain it as closely as you possibly can. And without that operating model, and I go beyond, I would, in terms of what you need in an operating model, I go beyond the traditional people, process, and technology. I go beyond that. But you need that in place. That's really your strategic corporate plan. And then all these other strategic plans around supply chain have to work within the context of that. If you don't match the operating model that you have with the plans that you're coming up with, then that is going to be a recipe for disaster.
Joannes, if I can come back to you, if I can summarize that in a quote, and Ian, you said it earlier, you said essentially you cannot exclude the human. So to Joannes, I ask you, do you agree that you cannot exclude the human, and particularly can the strategic decision making that Ian's talking about, is that something that could be absorbed into an automated framework that you've already applied to the more mundane day-to-day running of business?
So on the question of do we have artificial general intelligence, we don't. So we are getting closer, arguably. LLMs are the exhibit sparks of general intelligence, but just sparks.
And agentic AI as well.
Sorry?
Agentic AI as well.
Yeah, it is. It's the same flavor. It's again, that's LLM all the way.
I say illusions of general intelligence.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can get to that point on a but anyway. So I would say. Lokad right now, I don't think, we have certainly no claim that we have software that are so sophisticated that they can bypass the need for human mind. In fact, at the core of our practice, we have what we call supply chain scientists who are engineers coding the numerical recipes. So that's a very human thing that we are not delegating yet to machines, although, again, algorithms can help to code faster with autocomplete and whatnot. Now the question, but still, the real question is, when you have human intelligences, are they put to a task that really add value, from the fact that they are general intelligence as opposed to be like pattern matchers or, something that can be mechanized. And my counter argumentation would be, in many companies, they are not making that much of I would say, especially companies operating supply chains, are not making, I would say, a very good use of the white collars that they have. They are still pretty much in the mindset of having hordes or corporate clerks who are, doing through a process, and compliance to the process is their goal. So you see, I see a lot of those companies operating supply chains, they treat the bulk of their white collars exactly like they treat their blue collars. There is a process, and adherence to the process is, excellency is defined as adherence to the process. And what is the problem? And obviously for blue collar, it's clear that's what you want. But then if we go into the territory of a white collar, that becomes very strange, because you see, information is orders of magnitude easier to mechanize than the real world. Dealing with physics stuff, for example, if you want to have a robot that will be able to weld, in all situations, that's extremely difficult, because
just moving a hand.
You have to hold a tool. You may have to support something that is heavy. I mean, and then you're in an environment where there may be dust. It might be all sorts of contaminants. I mean, we are talking of extremely advanced robotics just to be able to do
something trivial.
To do something that someone could do within a few months of training. Now, if we go into this world of information, pretty much it's, at least, on paper, it's the constraints are not nearly as demanding. You know, we can move gigabytes of data around, no problem. People who are, you know, doing those white collars are already working with computer system. So all the information that they already get it through a computer. All the information that they produce is already entered into a computer. So you see, we have a framework that is already entirely digital. And what I'm saying is that if we go back to the use of humans, is that companies are using, again, most of their white collars as, generally speaking, as those coprocessors, you know. So they have what the processor of the computer can do with the software we have, and then we just have someone in the middle to fill the bits. But are we really using the intelligence of those people? And my argumentation is no. And if there is a question of strategic importance, is to make sure that all the white collars that you have are put to contribute to things where only a general intelligence can deliver that. If it's something that's where you don't need general intelligence, then it should be mechanized.
Yeah, I agree that your whole focus on the mechanistic, to my mind, that is what basically bookends what is automation and what you need the human for. And the moment where the human really supplies value, and as you say, Joannes, probably isn't deployed correctly in supplying that value, is in the intuitive, where you cannot mechanistically provide any intuitive, like hey, but the plane's going to be obsolete in 10 years, so why would we do this, etc. That's something that you can't mechanistically, I think, construct. So where you need the human is where they need to provide an organic kind of input to a problem or to a situation. If we're talking about event management or supply chain operational management, and it's I think you can have diagnostic mechanisms relatively easily. One area that I think is still rife for work is in the employment of feedback loops that help to generate, within a mechanistic context, help to generate proactive solutions. And in the actual accumulation of information from a wider variety of data origins into that proactive mechanistic operational management, but you can't beat the intuitive side of things. There's an emergent aspect in what a human brings to a context where they're trying to look at a problem or even more importantly, I think, anticipate a problem.
I very much agree. Yes, I very much agree. And here I would blame, the time series perspective. Again, literally the mainstream practice of supply chains nowadays is all around time series. But if you look at what companies that are very good with their data, very good at doing something intelligent with the feedback that they get, like Amazon, for example, Amazon is very smartly using the feedback that it gets from its customers to sort out most of their supply chain and logistic issues. And they do that in a systematic fashion. If you have a delivery guy that is very routinely flagged as, losing packets, losing parcels and whatnot, Amazon will stop using this provider. They will switch to another. If a vendor is causing problems, they will kick the vendor. If et cetera, et cetera. So they don't, and it's just about making a reasonable use of the feedback data that they collect. And they need humans to imagine what sort of feedback they can collect. And then they need, again, other humans, engineers, to craft the numerical recipes that will decide when to kick a vendor, when to notify a vendor that there is a problem, when to notify a logistic provider. And maybe, I'm not into the secrets, but I suspect they do also a lot of smart optimization, such as, I have noticed that this transporter is quite reliable in those conditions, but not in those conditions. And thus I am using this transporter, but only under those settings, because I know that under those settings, based on the feedback I have, it's a good option. Maybe not so much for in other situations, etc., etc. But here, that means just that to have, I would say, a broader vision about what is a piece of relevant data, not just your time series about demand and whatnot, what you get in s&op, and I would say a vision that is very much with an engineering mindset, which is how can I provide the deep fix for a problem? Not just because, again, most of companies that I see and supply chain directors, I see them going from one emergency to another, firefighting all the time. And the problem is that if your bandwidth is completely consumed by just dealing with a never-ending stream of emergencies, you can't possibly improve anything. And I think the opposite of that with Amazon has been to engineer deep fixes for any situation that they were encountering. So you see a problem, you don't fix the instance of the problem, you fix the class of problems. And then you move on to the next class, so you can have, you can eliminate a lot more problems that way.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that again comes back to finances, because if you've got the deep pocket to have the kind of thought process that you're alluding to there, that's one thing. But unfortunately for most supply chain managers, they don't work in an environment where they're flush with cash to be able to address problems in that fashion. That and also they're playing catch up, right? They're playing catch up. They don't have the time. They're putting out the flyer. They're playing catch up, so they're in a vicious circle, and that's where if you get an opportunity as a practitioner to work in the context of a strategic project with somebody, don't put the model first. Put that supply chain manager first and understand the supply chain manager's world as it exists today, and then think as though you're Amazon and try and work out how that supply chains manager world could exist and could work so that he isn't playing catch up. That's the opportunity you've got. But unfortunately, generally speaking, most supply chain managers pursue strategic projects in the same manner that they pursue their day-to-day world, which is it's just another fire. I've got a project that I've got to come up with the network for the next 5 years, and I'll put that fire out in 3 months' time when this guy gives me a network. People from both sides don't approach it right, but I think it could be approached differently by the OR practitioner, thinking differently about what his role is.
Well, gentlemen, I'm mindful of time, so I do want to come back to you, Ian, and just ask, because there's a section actually in the conclusion of your paper where you talk about practical optimality. So as a means of steering us towards a bit of a conclusion, what are the practical steps that people can take in the pursuit of optimality?
Yeah, again, I'm coming at it from the strategic end of things and not being the guy on the shop floor actually trying to get the product in the hands of the customer at that time. So basically, what you have to do in looking at optimality is think about optimality with the view set of how will that execution actually take place. What you need to do is make sure that you're focused on bringing to the table a solution that is feasible, that is operable, and is such in the context of potentially the way the company operates today. But if you have the capability and you're involved in a project that gives you this freedom, come up with a solution that comes up with optimality in the context that can be executed optimally, which is a very different approach. And importantly, understand the stakeholders' true objectives, understand the sponsors' true objectives, understand the company's true objectives, not necessarily their observed or their espoused objectives. And to the extent that they're willing to listen to that, which they're generally not, try and produce a solution in that vein. At all times, though, make sure that you're working with humans and not with the model only.
Thank you. And Joannes, anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a good one from I would say, a software vendor perspective. I would say when it comes to optimality, do not trust software vendors too much.
Except us.
Yes, obviously, except us. And in particular, take into account that there are classes of softwares like system of records and system of reports that do not deal in decisions and thus cannot even deal with optimization at all, you see, because if you have, again, system of records, or so ERP, CRM, WMS, all those management systems, or a system of reports, business intelligence, and whatnot, those things are very frequently advertised as bringing optimized decisions. You know, by design, those classes of software do not even touch the problem. And thus, it's not that they are bad at optimizing, they don't optimize in the first place. And so my message would be, do not try to find your, I would say, path to optimality in your next ERP upgrade, because by definition, an ERP is a system of records. It do not care about decisions, and it care even less about the fact that those decisions can be optimal in any shape or form.
To be fair, that is something you've written about before, so
Yes.
I will be sure to put that really nice little article. Well, sorry, not little article, it's a short article. What I meant there was short article. But again, in which you talk about systems of reports, systems versus systems of intelligence, excuse me. Systems of record, systems of report, and systems of intelligence. But it is customary here, Ian, to give the final word to the guests. So if there's anything else you want to mention or something we didn't say, you can close uninterrupted.
Yeah, I like that. From a software vendor, do not trust software vendors. I really like that, because over 40 years, one of the other things I've bug in my mind is the extent to which I've witnessed hype around OR, hype around technology, hype in the whole idea of supply chain. For the longest time, to my mind, is a type of hype, in a sense. And I've actually written on this, Conor, which you won't be surprised about. But I think what we have to do is just learn to live in a world where you know how to work your way through the hype, work your way through the weeds, and understand what really works. That's the key. What is real?
Well, on that note, I shall say I have no more questions. Joannes, thank you for your time. Ian, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, guys. It was a privilege for you to invite me, and I really look forward to learning more about Lokad, and whether I'm insane or not. That's the key.
Yes, one of the keys. Yes.
We'll send you a diagnostic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.